Cover One Buffalo podcast. You're joining your host, Greg Tompsett, tonight as we go into the next in our series of position previews. And tonight we're going to go into the defensive backs, both cornerbacks and safeties. And there is no person I would rather go through that detail with than my friend and colleague in the podcast world, Bruce Nolan of the Bruce Exclusive and the Buffalo Rumblings Empire. Bruce, how we doing?
Dude, I am fantastic. There's this weird niche that's kind of been carved out now where every time someone wants to talk about defensive backs, they call me and I'll love with you. Couldn't possibly be happier about it.
No, hey, it's, when people, throw in those little tidbits, and I know that you were into the coaching realm at one point and going through some of the different pieces there. It's something where I think people appreciate when someone has kind of that next level of knowledge to be able to help explain things. And that's one thing that I certainly strive to do. And one thing that I appreciate about your show previously, Nick and Nolan, and now kind of branching out into the Bruce Exclusive. I like that you're consistently able to take complex, difficult concepts, ideas, topics, and make them digestible and approachable. And that's certainly, again, something I strive to do here on this show. And it's really what this series is supposed to be, to help those fans who maybe have heard a little bit about what's going on with the Bills kind of dive back in. And then some of the diehards get a refresher as they get ready for the season.
Well, no pressure or anything. Now I better deliver.
So without further ado, we will take a look at this. And obviously, again, I advise you guys, Bruce just did an awesome series on his podcast of, kind of common football myths, and went through some of the, run to set up the pass and big receivers in the red zone. I joined him to do one about how common some of the fantasy understanding of the value of players has come. And obviously Bruce's hill to die on, that quarterback wins are not a stat. I advise you guys to go check out that series. It was a lot of fun. But what we want to do tonight is to be able to get into what the Bills have put together here. And we'll start with some of the lower level guys, some of the different people just on each of the roster groups at corner and safety. And really what I think Sean McDermott is, built with the knowledge of the position coaches. Brandon Beane has bought into the kind of players that they need. And I think is maybe one of the underappreciated strengths and backbone of this roster is the versatility and the capability of this secondary. And I'm excited to dive into it with you tonight.
I'm ready, man. Let's do it.
All right. So one, just as a whole, each time that I've gone through kind of this series, we'll kind of prepare and take a look at some of the different pieces of what the roster setup is. So I'll share with the fans here my screen as you kind of take a look again at our friends over at Spot Track, and being able to take a look at what Brandon Beane has put together. So, on the roster, we currently have 15 players in the defensive backfield. And with what I feel fairly confident is an accurate statement of if not the deepest, one of the deepest secondaries in the NFL, and if not the most talented, one of the most talented secondaries in the NFL. But we're paying them the 14th most money. Now, obviously, we'll get into one player in particular that's going to skew that number dramatically in the very near future. But right now, you can tell this is the value, just like that pocket when you have a rookie quarterback contract. When you have a rookie superstar corner on his rookie contract, you're able to take advantage of this exact scenario, that you can have this much depth and talent to be able to put that together. But any high level thoughts on the level of depth that they've been able to put together?
Depth matters in all positions. I think that depth matters in the defensive secondary more so than people might think, because when you have offensive line, one of the things that people have consistently talked about with the offensive line is that you are able to get by with some get by guys. And if you can't have a superstar at every position because you can't pay them, but you can, if you have a good left tackle and a good center, you can be all right with a decent left guard, with just a get by left guard. And in the defensive secondary, if you have Achilles heels in the secondary, they can be taken advantage of. The offense can manipulate it to the point where if you have a really, really, really bad safety we can find a way to make that work against you. If you have a really bad CB2, we can find a way to make that work against you too. And so secondary depth is, I would argue, just as important as wide receiver depth, although we don't talk about it as much. Having waves of bodies who are competent and scenarios where you can't necessarily be schemed into a weakness, which is something that offensive coordinators in this league are becoming extremely adept at doing, which is scheming you into a weakness. And if you have talented bodies, I would much rather have 5 decent, solid players than 1 excellent one and 4 bad ones, because it's just the way that secondary play has evolved, to the point that you can't just have one guy. Even if that one guy is Daryl Revis, even if that one guy locks down one receiver, that doesn't necessarily mean that the secondary as a whole is going to be good, because we can scheme things away. And yeah, okay, you lock down our one guy, but the way that we've kind of evolved as an offense in this league is that we can manipulate coverages. We'll talk a little bit about coverages being manipulated later, I'm sure, but pace and space is becoming such a priority in this league right now that depth is so important. And I'm very, very pleased that the Bills have solid, good depth. You can make an argument this is one of the most talented rosters in general that Sean McDermott's ever had, but certainly from a defensive backfield standpoint, one of the most talented he's ever had.
Yeah, I agree, and it really comes in. I even threw out kind of a warm-up question in our prep on, as I'm debating with the new roster construction, and again, we went over that on a previous show, that I think some fans perceive the change in the CBA to being 2 free roster spots and that you simply get a 54th and 55th guy. Unfortunately, there are in-season flexibilities to flex up to a 54th and 55th player off of the practice squad without exposing those players to waivers going back and forth. But we're still going to have that painful cut down day. And when that day comes, I'm curious if that toughest roster spot battle is going to end up being the 9th DB, maybe even 10th. I think we had 10 for quite a few games last year. A 9th O lineman. Again, we had 10, several of those, or a 9th defensive lineman. And it's crazy when you rattling off guys that if you lean towards one versus the other, you're talking about a Evan Baum or a Daryl Williams or an Ike Bacher or a Ryan Bates, or on the D line, a Trent Murphy or a Daryl Johnson or a Vincent Taylor, or in the defensive backfield, an EJ Gaines or a Dane Jackson or a Dean Marlowe. That I just rattled off 10 names, and that there is a decent chance that 6 or 7 of those guys could get cut. And those are 10 NFL roster caliber players, which is an amazing problem to have, but a problem nonetheless. Do you think, but I know we'll get into the details, the show goes, do you feel strongly that one of those is going to be more in line with the strategy for the roster going forward?
I sat down and I tried to decide, okay, 8th and 9th offensive lineman, 8th and 9th defensive lineman, 8th and 9th defensive back. And I didn't enjoy that exercise, Greg. I'm actually upset at you for making me do it, because it was very uncomfortable. And if it's uncomfortable right now on July 19th for me, I can't imagine how uncomfortable it's going to be for the coaching staff later on. But sitting there saying, okay, Daryl Williams, Evan Boehm, Ike Boettger, Ryan Bates, those are probably those 4 for 2 spots. Mm-hmm. You're probably thinking that, assuming you believe that Spencer Long is your swing interior guy and Ty Nsekhe is your swing tackle guy. If you assume those 2 roles are occupied by those people, and that may not even be true. I mean, yeah. Would it shock the world if Ty Nsekhe didn't make this team or if Spencer Long didn't make the team? No. So you could make an argument that instead of those 4 players for 2, you could have 6 players for 4 spots. And so that gets really hectic real fast. Then you move to the defensive line. You go, okay, it's a little bit more secure there because you had free agent acquisitions brought in. You assume that those players are not going to not make the roster this time around. So you've got Hughes, Addison, Epinesa, Locks, Starr, Ed Oliver, Quentin Jefferson, Harrison Phillips, Vernon Butler. I mean, it's not outside the complete realm of possibility Harrison Phillips wouldn't make the team, but I think we're assuming he's a lock at this point. So you've got Murphy.
Maybe they cheat and hide him on the if he's not
maybe he's not ready
back.
yet.
Yeah, I've wondered that if that's a freebie they could hide for 6 weeks.
But you have Murphy and Daryl Johnson then for spot number 9. Mm-hmm. So it's okay. Do I take Do I take a flyer on tools and a four-face special teams player? Or do I want to make sure that I kind of hedge against the possibility that AJ Epinesa doesn't develop as quickly as we'd like and make sure we have a reliable player in Trent Murphy that we like? I mean, we don't need the $8 million right now. So that wasn't very comfortable either. And then I went to the defensive backs and I said, okay, White, Wallace, Norman, Gaines, Taryn Johnson, Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde. All right, now what? Now I've got Dane Jackson, Jaquan Johnson, Saran Neal, Dean Marlowe for spots 8 and 9, probably, assuming we could have 10.
Yeah, that's 11 guys you just rattled off there. It's hard to know. Is that 2 or 3 of them? Yeah.
It got real messy. Out of that group, the one I had the most discomfort with, just because I didn't like the way they fit, the one I had the most discomfort with was offensive line. Yeah. Of that group, the one I hated the most was offensive line, because I can see a little clarity in roles when it comes to the defensive backfield. I can see a possibility. Okay, well, if they think this, they might go this way. But if they think this, they might go a different way. You can kind of see like a flow chart in your head of the paths that they would take. But with offensive line, it's like, well, I don't know. Let's see how Cody Ford does. Everything trickles from there, you know?
Well, and I think that leads us perfectly into tonight's show. And we'll do the same that we have each week. We'll start at the bottom of the roster, work our way up. We'll do that in 2 swim lanes here, for starting with corner. I'll put you on the spot here. A question I didn't even give you prep for. Did you know Ike Brown was a human that existed?
I did, but only because, so funny story. Okay, first off, you know how much I love it when you don't prep me for things. I just love spontaneity. Really is my middle name. My wife always tells me how much she loves my spontaneity, Greg. That if you know anything about me, you know that's definitely a hallmark characteristic of Bruce. But the fact of the matter is that the only reason that I knew that Ike Brown was a person was because I did an article on Buffalo Rumblings that was comparing the 19 position rooms to the 2020 position rooms. Nice. And I was like, oh, Ike Brown, that's a guy. I totally knew he was a guy. It's a real human that I totally knew existed.
Yeah, when I looked, I'm like, is Isaiah Brown? Is that the same okay, that's the same person. Okay, all right. He's a UDFA out of FIU. I learned that prepping for this show. I didn't realize he had been one of the UDFA signings to get us up to our 91 guys, which I don't even technically know if we made it there. I think we stopped at 88, if I remember right. But let's start on the actual depth chart. So apologies to our friends Garrett Taylor, even Cam Lewis and Josh Thomas are some guys at UDFAs. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that they come in. So feel free to throw them in here if you think they can give Dane Jackson a run for his money. But I'm going to start the bottom of the legitimate roster caliber guys at Dane Jackson, and that I know Brandon Bean spoke. That's a big priority for them on day 3. Is that's where they start to shift from purely best on the board to best player on the board who has a realistic path to the roster. They're not going to pick a guy that they know is an automatic cut, and it's just not worth investing the pick to then eat it. So saying something like that, and that, I'll say, I don't know if maybe not 4th round, but I saw plenty of mock draft machines going in that Dane Jackson was a consistent 4th or 5th, for sure, early 6th round pick. So I felt decent about the value getting him in the 7th. What are your thoughts on if there's a path for Dane Jackson to make this roster?
I do think there's a path for Dane Jackson to make this roster. I think a lot of it depends on Taryn Johnson and how he bounces back after a lackluster sophomore season. I think people quickly forget about Taryn Johnson, and the way that a lot of people felt about Taryn Johnson coming into his 2nd year was, holy crap, we got a missile out of the slot. We have a really significant baller coming in from the slot. And, he struggled with tackling his 2nd year. He struggled with injuries. Not shockingly, he struggled with injuries based on the way he plays. But I think that having Dane Jackson as a potential in the slot who shares some of that physicality, who shares some of that aggression that you like to see from slot defenders, I think having a traditional nickel like Taryn Johnson and then having a backup plan like Dane Jackson gives him a reasonable path to the roster. I mean, if Taryn Johnson gets hurt again in training camp, I don't think it's unreasonable for Dane Jackson to make this roster in his spot. Now, I don't know if Dane Jackson has a reasonable chance at outside corner just because of how deep they are with bodies. But if you just look at nickel, and I think a lot of that depends on how you feel about EJ Gaines.
Yeah.
Whether or not EJ Gaines is going to compete for a nickel role. I am personally of the opinion that EJ Gaines is an outside corner in this defense because that's primarily where we saw him the last time. Last time he was here, we saw him primarily at CB2 as a boundary corner. And I don't know why they would bring him back and then throw him into a spot that he didn't show success in the first time. Not because he's a bad player, but he showed success on the outside. So I am of the opinion that we should chalk EJ Gaines up as an outside corner until we see otherwise. Now, if EJ Gaines comes in and starts taking reps at slot, that changes my opinion on whether or not Dane Jackson has a reasonable chance of making this roster.
And I think that's the exact right thought process, and that, being able to figure out where do they envision him. And I know Brandon Beane always hedges anytime those things come up. He's very careful about what he shares, where those things are, and what he's never going to show his cards in that manner. That he talked about his ability to play outside, because I think they want that to be versatility. But I agree. I certainly saw him as that kind of nickel insurance policy, and that I love Taryn Johnson and the way he plays. We'll talk to him a bit more here in a moment. But he's shown in back-to-back seasons now that we need to be prepared with that insurance policy, that he may not be a guy that you can, depend on for 16 games. And Eric always likes to cue it up as he loves the way that Taryn fires his gun, and that he's always throwing his body in there. He's never going to go half speed, and that it's awesome. It reminds me a little of the young Antoine Winfield, and his desire for contact belies his size. Well, unfortunately, Antoine Winfield was able to do that with impeccable technique, always incredible posture, and being able to follow through in a safe and healthy manner. Taryn Johnson hasn't shown that capability, and that if we're going to go that route, I have a feeling that that's where Dane Jackson could show himself to do that. So it's going to be interesting. And another player that I'm a little confused with, and I'll give no better example than in the prep for this show, I cut and paste which segment to put him in 3 times. So I changed my mind back and forth twice and ended up landing with corner, because I that's kind of where he ended the season. What is Siran Neal?
That was the question coming out of college for him too. He was a Swiss Army knife at Jacksonville State. And one of the questions coming out of college for him was, how are they going to use him? And the Bills had him as a safety primarily up until last training camp. And last training camp, one of the kind of low key stories was that they moved him to corner full time. And specifically, they were moving him to corner. We actually saw snaps on the outside, but more importantly, he saw snaps in that big nickel role that we talk about all the time. And when you have a nickel corner like Taryn Johnson, who doesn't have the size component to be able to play nickel against all nickel offensive players. I mean, Taryn Johnson can play nickel against players like Cole Beasley, but Taryn Johnson's not going to play nickel against players like Gronk. If you flex out Gronk, you don't want him there. If you have a running back that has fairly notable size, you don't want that to be somebody who Taryn Johnson covers in the slot either. Taryn Johnson is a very traditional slot nickel corner against traditional slot players. And Siran Neal has a little bit more of that size. I think that really when you come to comparing players, you have Jaquan Johnson, Siran Neal, Dean Marlowe. You have these players, and Siran Neal and Dean Marlowe actually have similar size profiles.
Yeah, very.
They're both 6 foot, little over 200 pounds. They're both 4'6" sort of guys. Whereas Jaquan Johnson is a 4'7" guy, 190, much more or less of an athlete. And Taryn Johnson, even so, smaller and although faster than that. And so you have different pieces here. And I think that the better comp for Siran Neal is whether or not Siran Neal or Dean Marlowe becomes the go-to big nickel in this year. I think that's where, if he finds a role, that's where it'll be.
I agree. I think he started to show more value as potentially a relatively special gunner on special teams. He really started to consistently play there. I'm actually excited about him getting a season to mentor with Taiwan Jones. And I think that short of, Robert Foster having kind of a Hail Mary of a preseason here and carving out that last spot. I know our friend Joe Marino has advocated for that path. So I'm trying to keep my mind open to it after I'd pretty much completely shut that off in my head. I think it's going to end up being Saran Neal and Taiwan Jones as our primary gunners. And I like that idea. I like the path where it kind of gives you the option to use him as the Swiss Army knife that I think everybody kind of foresaw him coming out. But I I still don't know that I love that solution. And we saw it where we had games where Taryn Johnson was dinged up mid game or missing the time that he did. It's really tough to trust that, hey, Dean Marlowe and Saran Neal are your, you know, game to game full snap allotment nickel players. And I really would like to see another step forward there. And I think that's where that whole draft fervor that came out of,
Mm.
looking for who is that next guy. Is Kyle Duggar going to be the secret weapon here to be able to step into that role? I think it was legitimate. I think it reached a fever pitch that was probably more a little overplayed. I don't know that it was quite as adamant of a need as people realize, but then just like everything else on the internet, it became so overplayed that people then turned it into no, they absolutely don't need it. And I was always back here in the middle, being like, no, that would have been fine if we added that. Because I don't know that I love where we're at.
Yeah, I don't think I would have turned down a Jeremy Chin
Oh,
at all.
oh man,
No, no, I was
I still see
I was
Cam
always
Chancellor.
yeah, I was always a much bigger Chin fan than Duggar. I didn't understand Duggar as a big nickel. I understood Chin as a big nickel for sure. And people were like, "No, we got to spend that on offense." I'm like, "Well, I mean, how comfortable are you? You know, given the fact that you play nickel the overwhelming majority of the time in this defense, how comfortable are you with Saran Neal being that guy who takes a significant percentage of snaps? Are you cool with that? Because so far, I'm just okay with that."
Well, and it kind of brings in this, and it's going to lead into the next two conversations in the layering that Brandon Bean has done, where I actually feel better about the potential in the defensive backfield because they're obviously taking some calculated risks, and we'll get to the big one in the next conversation. But when you have guys that your safety net is, well, if that guy busts out, our worst case scenario is Levi Wallace, or if this guy gets injured, our worst case scenario is that. It brings us to a player like EJ Gaines, where I think he's a really nice luxury. They signed him for literally nothing. He's actually one of the few players on the Bills roster that are signed for the true veteran exception, where they're able to pay the veteran player more based on his years of service in the league, but he counts against the cap as a minimum. I want to say he's one of only two on the roster that are like that. So he gets the minimum deal from a cap standpoint, but he actually makes closer to 985,000 or whatever it is. Um, one thing I don't know if you did look at in the prep for the show. Do you know the last time EJ Gaines played an NFL football game?
Let me think. So last year he didn't play at all, right?
Hmm.
The year before he left us, he played for the Browns for a little bit. So a bit of early 2018 with the Browns.
November 4th, week 6 of the
There we go.
2018 season. So it's been more than a season and a half since he's played an NFL game. And that's kind of a sobering period of time for me in a guy that I really, he's the ultimate when he's healthy
Mm.
guy. That there's always that kind of caveat that people like to bring up, and I mean, he's actually still within the range of a normal football player. He's 28 years old. It's not like he's 33 or something like that. But it's tough to assume that that is anything you can bank on, a likely scenario. Let's go with the idea that he is able to contribute. Do you think he's competing for that roster spot in a three-headed race for cornerback 2, or to push, let's say, to shoehorn himself in between Dane Jackson and Taryn Johnson?
I am of the opinion that Josh Norman is going to get every single opportunity possible
Agreed.
to walk away with that CB2 spot. I think that the scheme fit, the Bills have shown that their their bias toward people they trust is strong.
Yeah.
It's really, really strong. And the way that they jumped on Norman and got him early, I have a very, very hard time imagining anybody else coming out of camp as CB2 aside from Josh Norman. Even if EJ Gaines played well, I think EJ Gaines is a backup plan for midseason on the outside. I think EJ Gaines is going to make sure you have depth there. I think the versatility to be able to play the slot is good, but I think really that's a CB3 pretty strong outside corner behind Norman, like the first man up. Like if White or Norman were to go down or something were to happen, Gaines would be your first man up. I think that's his role if he stays healthy.
And I think that's accurate in the sense that you don't want to depend on him, but if you're able to manage him in short bursts, it's a nice luxury to have, and it's almost similar to what I think they're hoping Ty Nsekhe is this year, is that, hey, we know we can't get 16 games out of Ty Nsekhe, even if, even if we were forced to, it just wouldn't happen. But if he's your backup plan and your swing guy and your sixth offensive tackle, and you need him for 1 game for Deion Dawkins and 2 games for Cody Ford, and they play 14 and 15, and he plays 3 plus 7 snaps a game in the other games is the jumbo set, all of a sudden, oh, that's really nice. And now you have this luxury of a playing caliber guy without needing to roll the dice that the health isn't there for the sustained period. And I think EJ Gaines fits in that window where he's better than your UDFA sign off the street normal guy, but he's not healthy enough to be depended on to where his skill level or talent is. So he fits in that window. And I agree. I think he's going to fit into that kind of weird intermediary somewhere between nickel, outside corner, and whatever's needed in that path. And you kind of already brought it here, with the next conversation that I want to preface this that I'm very much in the stance that cornerback 2 is one of the biggest needs and very easily arguably the biggest need on the team. I made the case that I thought a young pass rusher was a little bit higher of a need going into the draft, but it was tomato tomato. It was the top 2, pretty easily. Now that we brought AJ Epinesa aboard, and he's not the speed pass rusher people thought, but he is a young investment there. And now we've gone a little period of time without a significant investment. We've now had 2 straight seasons of a UDFA being the highest snap count at cornerback 2. Last year's reclamation project of Kevin Johnson worked out reasonably well, though he didn't cash in all that much. Now we're coming in with, what I know you and Joe Marino and many others are in our realm have voiced significant concern over what exactly are we going to get from Josh Norman. I'm much closer to that than what I'm going to make the case for here, but just for the sense of good discussion tonight, I've tried to make the case that I'm good with Josh Norman because I think the safety net of Levi Wallace and EJ Gaines mitigates a great deal of that risk that's there. That if he's truly gone, and we do, obviously, the contract is showing we're giving a great deal of benefit of the doubt right now. If he's truly gone, the results will speak for itself, and that no amount of loyalty is going to force John Butler, Leslie Frazier, Sean McDermott to keep putting him out there to get toasted. So maybe it burns us with the Jets or Miami, but it's going to show itself, and they're simply going to go to Levi Wallace in my head. That's what I'm telling myself. Whereas if they really did hit on something, and I made the case after the signing that I can tell myself a story where a guy had the franchise tag, it got rescinded, he was bitter. Washington threw a ridiculous 5-year, $75 million contract at him. He signed it, got there, realized it was a, really poor culture, terrible place. We're now hearing through other reports that it really was genuinely a terrible place, that nothing good was going on in that culture and environment. He was still cashing a check, put into the wrong scheme, and was going through the motions, and that he really, if properly motivated and rejuvenated, had more in the tank than what the metrics or film showed, and that it wasn't simply he was gone, and that, if you want to pass judgment that he wasn't giving his best effort based on his paycheck, I know plenty of people who are, have moments where they don't maybe give 100% of their effort for their paycheck. So I can tell myself a story where it wasn't purely that he had lost a step and can never get it back. Is is there any path where you can see that, or am I just spinning myself a tale that it's inevitable that Levi Wallace takes over here?
There's absolutely a path where Josh Norman has a reasonable year. The thing that makes me wonder is I don't know if the ceiling is there anymore for Josh Norman. So Josh Norman was a fairly limited player coming out of college. He was a fairly limited athlete who survived on recognition, physicality, and ball skills. And he, coming out of college, Josh Norman was not exactly what you would call the ideal athlete now. Tease Tabor comes to mind when you think about
Yeah.
limited athletes, and he was drafted appropriately. He was drafted on day 3 for a reason. And the fact that a player like that had an all-pro season at all is already way against the odds. I mean, he has outplayed his draft status by a bajillion percent already. Bajillion's technical term, by the way, just so you know. And so we should be happy about that for Josh Norman. The idea that he would somehow regain that status is staggering to me, because I don't know if he ever would have regained that status anyway, because he didn't regain that status at any point ever. And he wasn't at that status beforehand either. So Josh Norman has been living off of one unbelievable season for essentially the entirety of his career thus far.
Yeah,
And
his only Pro Bowl or All-Pro season.
exactly. So it wasn't like he was a good player and then he peaked. I mean, he blew up and then never saw it again.
I
Now,
think some would say 14 and 16 were good seasons, but I think it was realistically probably one amazing season, two good seasons, and then five average or below average seasons, including one or two that were probably well below there.
Josh Norman has been benched quite a bit in his career. I mean, for poor play, he's been benched many times for poor play. Scattered amongst the All-Pro season that he had. He was long, he was physical, he had ball skills, and he had good recognition. He was tough, and that is what you look for in a day 3 corner. He's exactly what you look for in a day 3 corner. We just can't project this idea that the All-Pro season was just the norm for Josh Norman, no pun intended. The normalcy that you're going to get back to now that he's in the system. I just think that's overstating him. I think that the ideal version of Josh Norman is, let's just get back to maybe 14 Josh Norman. Let's get back to passable Josh Norman, right?
Maybe that first season in Washington, that 16 season was still a solid, good season. He wasn't, a problem, was playing decent football, even though he was out of the right scheme. He was playing well. It really fell off in 17, 18, 19.
And the thing that makes you wonder about that is why? Why did he fall off? And so it's hilarious, because on one hand, you have people say, well, he stank in Washington because he's in a bad scheme. And those exact same people tell me that his first season in Washington was good. And I go, well, hold on now. That's the left with the right carry the 2. I don't hold on now. If you think that he struggled because he's not in a good scheme, that's one thing. If you think he struggled because he can't run anymore, that's a different problem. And we're going to find out real fast whether or not he can run anymore, because my personal opinion, and I said this when he got released, so I'm going to be intellectually consistent, but long before the Bills ever signed him, when he got released, my exact words on social media were, Josh Norman is what happens when a guy who can't afford to lose a step loses a step. And when you come out as a 4'6" corner, you can't afford to lose a step. And I think he lost a step. So we're going to find out real fast whether or not I'm wrong, because I'd love to be wrong, because having a CB2 who is competent gives us 2017 EJ Gaines, which I would be thrilled about, having a level of competency across from Tre'Davious White, because you're going to get targeted in that spot. So having that level of competency would be good. And I think that's the ceiling for Josh Norman this year, is 2017 EJ Gaines level play.
And obviously that would be a huge win. If we got to that point where it was that kind of season, it would be a huge boon. And I think I'll be fair. I think that it's a 10 to 15% chance that rekindled, motivated, surrounded by some of the talent we're about to talk about, with the deepest front seven the Bills have had in a long time, that he could be put into that perfect window to really limit and manage the potential risk to have that season. I think that it's another 35 to 45% chance that he's passable, the weak link in the secondary that we complain about here or there because he does get picked on, but the rest of the defense is just good enough to make up for it. And then I think there's another 20 to 30% chance here that he just is completely gone. And I almost hope for the top 10 or 15 or the bottom 10 or 20 here, because if it is, just plug in Levi Wallace. We know what we've got. We've got the younger Josh Norman. We've got the guy who's limited but hasn't lost a step yet, has 2 years in the system and knows what's going on. We know we're not going to get the ceiling. We know we're going to get big boyed a couple times by the, maybe Devontae Parker this year instead, or maybe, again, maybe it's Odell Beckham Jr. instead of Jarvis Landry, or whatever it might be, that you're going to have these moments where you just, he's going to get out physical, but the rest of the time he's in the right spot. He makes the right play. He's a cog in the machine and makes it work. So I feel like our worst case scenario is that there's flashes of moments from Josh Norman enough to rekindle the faith and trust, but not bad enough to get him benched. I think that's my worst case scenario.
Yeah, fail fast at that position, because we have we can afford to fail fast. We have Levi Wallace, who has proven to be okay. He's proven to be okay. And we have EJ Gaines, where if he stays healthy, we know he can do the job. So if we're gonna have roll out, Josh Norman at CB2, let's succeed or fail quickly. And let's get that answer diagnosed quickly so we can make sure that we have the proper CB2 and we don't lose too many games because of it.
Now, we've now entered the flowering praise of Tre'Davious White portion of the evening. So congratulations for those of you who have made it to this point. One of my favorite things to look at in how special Tre'Davious White is, and a lot of fans don't realize in the scouting that goes into it, finding that guy, there's a lot of players that people like, and that, someone like Jeffrey Okudah, it's just easy to see what that player is going to become. The challenge comes in when you don't have just those off the charts physical skills. Is the technique going to translate? Is their discipline going to move from the SEC college level to the pros? And very few times has it not only translated, but just enhanced and really improved to the level Tre'Davious White is. One of my favorite things is to look at the mock draftable web and the comps. Let me read off the names of the most similar athletes of Tre'Davious White coming out. Dwight Lowry, Sidney Jones, Taryn Johnson, Jason Bray, DeAndre White, Terrell Brown, Bruce Branch, Mike Jenkins, Lamar Grant, Patrick Dyson. That's how special Tre'Davious White's technique is. Those are the 10 most similar NFL cornerback draft athletes that were in the running for his makeup. He is just such a special technician. Bruce, why should we give Tre'Davious White all the dollars?
All the Pakula bucks, literally all the Pakula bucks. When the Bills drafted Tre'Davious White, I think the resounding theory from everybody involved was, okay, yeah, a good solid double there. Yep. A lot of people said, good solid double. We don't know if he'll ever be a Pro Bowler, but he'll always be a really good solid starter. It's like one of those, well, I don't have anything to complain about sort of picks. And the reason they thought that is because there were a couple specific avenues of Tre'Davious White's athletic testing that didn't necessarily jump out as being, okay, this is a guy with clear ability that is dynamic elite athlete. The thing is interesting about Tre'Davious White's RAS score is that he really would have done super well if it weren't for a couple of things. He was, if you look at the RAS for him, which you love the mock draftable thing. Yep. I like the I like
Relative athletic
the
score,
relative
math bomb.
athletic score
Yeah,
too.
anyone follow at math bomb on Twitter? It's fantastic follow, and it's great around draft time.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And if you look about Tre'Davious White and you say, okay, what was his relative athletic score? It was all greens except for the explosion numbers.
Mm.
The explosion numbers, the vertical jump, the broad jump, the short shuttle, the things that classify explosion. And that was the question. Okay, he's going to be a good corner. Yeah, we got greens and yellows, and he's perfectly reasonable. And so when you draft a player like that at the bottom of the first round, everyone just kind of nods and goes, "Yeah, we get it. The tape was good. He wasn't a super elite athlete. Okay, great, cool." And
Super quick aside,
go ahead.
people plant that seed for AJ Epinesa. Just a quick moment there. Plant
Yep,
that seed in the back of your minds for AJ Epinesa when we have this conversation in 3 years.
it's absolutely true. Because now I will say that I do believe that athleticism matters for defensive backs a lot more than for other positions on the
Sure.
field. And
So the concern was more fair.
yeah, and it was very reasonable because Tre'Davious White had good tape at Louisiana State. I mean, people don't remember this. That coming out, they were like, "Oh, he can give you some punt return ability too." Like he's
Yep.
never returned a punt for the Bills ever, but coming out, that was hey, he could be a nice CB2 and punt returner. That's what everyone thought.
Terrence McGee. Yeah.
Yeah, he's going to be a nice Terrence McGee. He's going to give you a good, solid CB2 for a decade. He'll give you a punt return utility. It turns out we had an all-pro on our hands, which is
Yeah.
great. But it's one of those scenarios where when you have a corner who has an RAS score in the sixes and they end up being elite, which Tre'Davious White is elite,
Oh, yeah.
you start looking for why is that? And then you start looking at all of the little nuances, the place where his eyes are always in the right spot, and the hand technique. Oh, goodness gracious, Greg, the hand technique. It's like non-safe for work, dude. Literally. It's always right where it needs to be, right in sync with his feet. His hands and his feet aren't out of chronology. It's where he's supposed to be. And Tre'Davious White, he does get a little bit grabby sometimes. We know that. He's gotten that's why PFF is so low on him, is because he gets the illegal contact penalties, and that sucks and everything. But when you realize that you're dealing with a good athlete, not an elite athlete, but a good athlete at the position, that's when you start to realize the level of sophistication in the technique for Tre'Davious White and the level of work that he puts in. And you see some of these LSU Tigers coming out and they talk about Tre'Davious White. And they talk about how he worked, and they talk about how he was ahead of the game when he was in college. And you realize, okay, that's why he's special.
And I think that obviously we'll have many more opportunities to speak about him. I do, for any fans who are concerned, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and the financial ramifications on the NFL, Trey White already had no incentive to sign early. Marcus Lattimore, Marlon Humphrey, Jalen Ramsey, and Tre'Davious White, the four of them, are going to have a game of chicken. They're going to wait and see who can sign first. Then I can beat that guy by $250,000. Then he'll beat that guy by $250,000. Then that guy will beat that guy by $250,000, all trying to be the first cornerback to ever make $20 million. I think all of them are going to make between 18 and 20 million. I'm perfectly fine making Tre'Davious White the highest paid cornerback in NFL history. I'm perfectly fine if he waits and he's fourth. I don't interpret any of that as a desire for Tre'Davious White to go elsewhere, and I feel very confident that Brandon Beane is budgeted in that reference zone, that range. He'd certainly love it to be 17 and a half and not 20, but that $1 to $2 million difference is not going to be the reason that Tre'Davious White goes somewhere else. He was their first big draft pick. He is fully bought in. He's the family that they showed in the Thanksgiving video. That was the family that they showed, the wife and kids at the Thanksgiving table all together and showing the video. It's little things like that. The Trey White Goalie Academy, all the different pieces. He is going to be a part of this future. And I, for one, hope that, just on principle, I hope that he goes fourth and does get $19.5 million a year, with a huge chunk of it up front, and is shown that you can come to Buffalo, play great, and become the highest paid player at your position. And that's something that can happen in Buffalo. And I think it's a great message to send.
The thing about the Tre'Davious White concerns is that I feel like they're tied to, ironically enough, Josh Norman in Carolina. And the fact that the franchise tag was rescinded from Josh Norman and he left, and they say, well, hold on, Brandon Beane was part of that front office. Okay, great. So first off, Brandon Beane does have some similarities with Dave Gettleman, specifically the aggressiveness, the willingness to trade up, things like that. He does have some similarities to Dave Gettleman, but he's already shown to have a fair amount of dissimilarities to Dave Gettleman as well. So this idea that just because Gettleman did it with Norman, Beane's going to do it with White, I don't think is necessarily always well earned. In addition to that, you have to consider the fact that Tre'Davious White's better than Josh Norman.
Yes.
Tre'Davious White's better right now than Josh Norman ever was. And the fact of the matter is that maybe Gettleman was right. Based on Norman's career arc and the way he played in Washington, Gettleman might have been right to rescind that franchise tag from him and let him walk.
Certainly, it looks like it right now.
And so this idea that they're going to do it with Trey White, I mean, would you want them to do it with Trey White if Trey White ended up bottoming out? Well, sure, you want it to be accurate in the hindsight. And so far, Gettleman's decision to get rid of him and use that money elsewhere, him being Josh Norman, looks like it was a stroke of genius. So just deep breath. Everything's fine. You know, how many misses has Brandon Beane really had at this point? How many people has Brandon Beane let walk? We're going to see with Shaq Lawson and Jordan Phillips real fast whether or not they were worth something else. And so far, Brandon Beane has done pretty well about that. And so when you have all pro talent, the question of whether or not you're going to re-sign them or not becomes a lot less of a concern. It's when you have that middle of the road. How far down the spectrum do you go before you say, okay, we can replace this guy? And for the Bills, it was obviously to the level of Jordan Phillips and Shaq Lawson. That was the answer. But this is their first crack at all pro level re-signing talent. We haven't had that issue yet. So just because we let Jordan Phillips walk, just because we let Shaq Lawson walk, just because Dave Gettleman, who was Brandon Beane's boss, let Josh Norman walk, none of that stuff applies to the situation. So deep breath, right? Exhale, namaste, right? Those things may not necessarily be applicable in this situation.
So and we'll move on to the safeties here, but I think you brought up the right names. It's been shown in most statistical analysis from a financial standpoint that it's almost impossible to overpay elite talent. Whether you pay Aaron Donald $20 million or $24 million just isn't going to be the reason that he is or is not worth that deal. The problem is paying the $4 and $6 million guys 10 or 11 million, which is exactly what Jordan Phillips and Shaq Lawson were. Is it, you know, I bring it up all the time. Just because you're not a good value doesn't mean you're a bum. Shaq Lawson and Jordan Phillips are good players. I think most of the projections from places like Over the Cap and Spot Track had them as $4 to $6 million guys, and that would have been fine. But if somebody wants to pay them 10 or 11 million, God bless them. Go get that money. But I'm glad it's not here. I don't think there's any scenario where we overpay for Trey White, and I think he's going to get paid and be here long term. As we pivot into the realm of safeties, one of the players that I had two players that were polar opposites during the season, and they were Jaquan Johnson and Daryl Johnson. One I was really excited about in the preseason, saw some incredible flashes, and then was progressively deflated and disappointed during the year. The other I watched flounder and get toasted all preseason and look pretty rough, and then slowly built my confidence as the season went along, including a pretty nice final, exhibition style game in week 17. What do you think we have in Jaquan Johnson? Is there any chance he's a hidden gem? And if he is, and there is a path of maybe a little more than something there, is it more as just the insurance policy in case something happens to Micah Hyde because he needs to stay in that deep secondary role? Or could he have the skill set to maybe bump Dean Marlowe out of that versatile safety 3 spot?
I am a unabashed Jaquan Johnson stan. So just be very familiar with that up front.
Brace yourselves accordingly.
Jaquan Johnson was coming into 2019, people thought Jaquan Johnson could be a first round pick, Greg.
Oh yeah.
Like that's how good his tape is at Miami. And
I
his
believe
tape,
he basically owned that turnover chain that they
yes,
had on the sideline. He had it on every highlight that I saw.
Jaquan Johnson's tape at Miami is stellar. He just tested like absolute flaming dog crap. That's the problem. He came out athletically and tested
Yeah.
so badly that people were like, listen, his tape's great, but you got to be able to run in the NFL. And when you run 4.7 as a defensive back, that's not great, Bob.
Yeah.
That's just it's not great, Jaquan.
Especially at 5'10", 191. It's not like he's got Jeremy Chin's physical stature
Right.
and then runs a 4.69. He is built like Taryn Johnson and then runs a 4.69.
Yeah, short, slow, and not long is not a good combination when you're athletes, and that's what Jaquan Johnson has. So I do think he's a hidden gem, but I need to define gem for you because I feel very similar to Jaquan Johnson about the way I feel about a reasonable backup quarterback, and that is a reasonable backup quarterback's goal should be okay. He can float the boat for 3 or 4 games and make sure that you're at 500. He cannot lose you the game, but you wouldn't feel comfortable with him as a 16 game preferred starter. That is typically what you're looking at in a backup quarterback. That's the way I feel about Jaquan Johnson. I feel like if Micah Hyde were to go down, Jaquan Johnson could float the boat for a couple of games and not lose us a lot of games, but he doesn't have the upper end athleticism to be able to be somebody who I would feel comfortable being a preferred starter. In regards to the second part of the question with Dean Marlowe, I don't think Jaquan Johnson's development affects Dean Marlowe almost at all. I think it's
Yeah.
Dean Marlowe and Saran Neal rather than Dean Marlowe and Jaquan Johnson. As I mentioned earlier, Marlowe and Neal might be duking it out for big nickel because they share similar athletic profiles. Jaquan Johnson is a very, very different athlete. I would not feel comfortable with him in big nickel. Number one, because he's not big. And number two, so it kind of defeats the purpose of the big
Yeah.
nickel. But also number two, he's not a twitchy, dynamic athlete. And down close to the line of scrimmage where things happen a lot faster. And you need to have, like Eric says, you need to be able to fire that gun quickly.
Yeah.
You got to pull that trigger and get downhill. That's not really what Jaquan Johnson does. You want his instincts and his knowledge of the scheme to be able to counteract his physical limitations. And he can do that better from a traditional safety role. I do think that it might be Dean Marlowe or Saran Neal as that big nickel. And it could end up being Dean Marlowe. We know how much the coaching staff trusts him. I mean, goodness sake, he had the bat phone. They were calling him on his couch. As Commissioner Gordon was calling, they put the Dean Marlowe signal up in the sky, and Dean Marlowe would come off his couch eating Cheetos and jump into Sean McDermott's scheme.
I almost feel bad that I think the new CBA structure where it added the veteran status, the unlimited 2 spots with unlimited veteran status on the practice squad with the free call up for multiple games during the year is almost just like a slap in the face taunting Dean Marlowe because it's such an easy fit to be able to be like, well, I mean, is anybody really going to sign him? We could probably cut him and just hide him there, and then he gets to practice all the time. When we need him, we could pull him in and play. I hope just personally for him because he's fought so hard to earn a roster spot, and that I called him the roster cockroach. He won't die. Like you can't get rid of him, and that it really became endearing to the point where he's not bad. His versatility is legit. I don't remember shaking my fist at the TV screen over Dean Marlowe getting toasted by anybody. I think that they're smart and they don't get him out there with the Julian Edelmans of the world and things like that. They're careful with how they disguise things, but I think that it's reasonable there, and I think that unfortunately for him, it's more likely that a Saran Neal would get claimed if he were to get waived, and that there's a chance he gets played with, similar to how they cut Kurt Coleman and brought him back last year immediately afterwards to play kind of some roster gymnastics. Unfortunately for him, he may get utilized that way. But many of the conversations we've had tonight have built to this final segment that I'm really excited to be able to talk about because I know you have a knowledge of this that I think is a good layer or two deeper than many fans realize, and that one of my favorite things with the Bills secondary is their ability to disguise coverages. It's actually one of the reasons I'm a little more optimistic about the reclamation project of Josh Norman is because I think that we can hide when the cornerback knows to pick on him. And one quick example is I love when you can see on film, and you don't often see it during the game just because the secondary and especially safeties, aren't even on the screen, for a good portion of the time. But when you see somebody like Jordan Poyer trail across the screen following the receiver in motion and know that they're giving the key to the quarterback that, oh, it's man, he's following him across the field. And then all they did was Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer switch spots and took the other spot into their new zone just to give a false key. It's like candy to watch things like that, where that they were just messing with them, or that they'll go down and, show a blitz off the edge and then drop back, or, show deep third and Micah Hyde will be 30 yards off the field and then come rushing up to show a different look. Talk a little bit about just the idea of what do disguising coverages, what kind of flexibility do they give? I think a good example was on one of the recent Locked On Bills series. You had some of the other guys that Joe Marino had on from the other teams, and I got a little mad because they called Jordan Poyer the free safety and Micah Hyde the strong safety, and then I stopped for a minute and was like, "Wait a minute, is that wrong? Or is that I kind of thought Hyde was the free safety," but I sat there for like 3 minutes being like, "Maybe that is right," and I don't even know for sure which one plays what. So, we're gonna take a moment here, and I ask the fans to slip into something comfortable and, maybe pour yourself a little drink so Bruce can talk nerdy with us. Bruce, let us know about disguise coverages.
Okay, so for those of you who are still with us at this point in the conversation, I apologize because it's going to get awfully nerdy in here. I struggle sometimes because I don't, I fully recognize that describing coverages via an audio medium is extremely bad because it's really need a visual medium for something like this. But I'm going to do my best. So when we talk about disguising coverage, is really basic concept that you're showing something that ends up not being true. You're showing something pre-snap that ends up not being true post-snap. That's what you mean by disguising coverages. If you really try and break it down, you have cornerback disguises and safety disguises. If you really want to try and break this is way more complicated than I'm making it, but I'm going to do my best to try to simplify this. A cornerback disguise could be multiple different things, right? The most common thing you see is you see a press alignment, and then they'll back off as the quarterback's knee comes up in the shotgun or something. They'll back off because when they press up, the quarterback's going to assume he's seeing man on the outside. And when they back off, it could be either a cover three, it could be off man. It gives you more options. So when the quarterback looks to his right or looks to his left, and maybe he follows the person in motion, he sees someone follow, and then he sees press on the outside, he goes, okay, I think this is man. What I am seeing based on what I've seen so far, the fact that they had a follow with motion and the fact that I see press on the outside, I think this is man. And then when his knee comes up, the cornerback will backpedal out and he'll be in zone or he'll be in off man. And now that changes things. You and I have talked about this before. Read chronology is a big part of offensive systems. If it's this, I'm going to start here. If it's this, I'm going to start somewhere else. And so think about the Erhardt-Perkins system that the Bills run, right? It's based on concepts. You can think of concepts as being routes in a package. On the left side of the line of scrimmage, you'll have one package. And on the right side of the line of scrimmage, you'll have a different package. And those packages are routes in combination. And so if Josh Allen, who talked about this, ironically enough, on a podcast a couple of weeks back, he said, one of the things I really want to do better this year is diagnosing what it isn't, instead of just diagnosing what it is, because that'll help my eyes be in the right spot at the right time more often. So if I'm sitting in the shotgun, I say, okay, this is cover two, I'm going to start on the left. Or, hey, this is cover one, I'm going to start on the right. The reason why you disguise coverages is to try to get the quarterback out of sync. You do it to have him look at something, think he knows what he's looking at, and then he looks back at that same spot and goes, this isn't right. I'm in the wrong spot for this coverage. He starts to panic. Hopefully the pass rush can get there. He makes a throw that's ill-advised. Things like that are happening. And the cornerback disguise, could be as simple as what I just mentioned. It could be as simple as he's going to align and press and then he's going to bail, right? Or it could be as complicated as let's go cover 6 trap Kathy. Okay. We're going to have a little fun with this. Okay. Cover 6 trap and trap coverage in general. Sometimes you hear like a trap 5 instead of a cover 2. This would be a cover 6 trap, sometimes called Kathy coverage. What this is it looks like cover 2 to a quarterback. It looks like cover 2. You have 2 deep. In this case, it would be Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, 2 deep. And the way you beat cover 2 is one of the ways you can beat them is by flaring out routes quickly. And you can beat that flare zone, that buzz to flat zone defender. You can beat them to the corner and get around them, especially if that person is a strong side linebacker or a weak side linebacker. You can flare out your running back, or you can flare out your tight end, and that can help beat to the corner. Well, here's the problem with that. If you show cover 2 and one of your outside corners is actually a jump corner, so he is going to play that exterior wide receiver down the field the way that you would expect it. So when the quarterback takes a snap, he thinks it's cover 2 because he sees 2 deep safeties. He makes a move and nobody moves with him on the motion and says, okay, this is cover 2 zone. I think that's what this is. He takes the snap. He sees the outside corner start to bail with the receiver and goes, okay, totally. I got it right now. This is absolutely cover 2. He knows he's going to throw that flat route now. I'm totally going to do it. But now all of a sudden that corner who bailed with that outside receiver turns around and comes back. He was baiting the quarterback to throw that flat route. Asante Samuel did this all the time and got all those pick sixes. And Nathan Peterman sees this coverage in his nightmares because he doesn't have the arm to be able to get it to the outside, and he gets jumped and it gets picked off because that corner was actually not a deep corner, and he wasn't really a flat corner. He was there to rob. You see sometimes robber coverage. You hear that corner's job as being to rob that flat route underneath. So that's an example of a corner disguise. It looks like cover 2. It acts like cover 2, but one of those sides of the coverage isn't cover 2. That corner is taking away the thing that you are doing because of what you think it is. It's almost like if you think about it like rock, paper, scissors, right? So if you have a guy and he says, okay, now I know Greg. Greg's a strong man. Greg is going to throw rock because that's the kind of guy Greg is. Okay. So he's going to throw rock and I'm totally going to throw paper. But Greg knows that I know that Greg is a strong guy and he's going to throw rock. So because of that, Greg brings his hand all the way down. The last minute, he goes scissors. That's essentially what this is. It is you playing off that's what they think it's going to be. And that's a corner disguise. But that's not what Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer do. Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer are so much more complicated than just that one little maneuver. For Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer, it could be a blitz and bail, like you already talked about. It could be rolling coverage, which is when you see single high and then it becomes 2 high after the snap, or 2 high and then it becomes single high after the snap. Or you can pull off one of my favorite coverages, which we're going to talk about for a brief second. We're going to talk about cover 2 invert, which is sometimes called 3 robber. Okay. I love cover 2 invert. It's like one of my favorites. And you can pull this off because of 2 traits that Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde have. They have versatility and they have range. Mm-hmm. And because you have that, you can pull this off. So cover 2 invert is something that doesn't even look like cover 2 at the snap. It looks like it's either single high or cover 3. That's what you think you're getting. You typically have a safety down in the box for this. And the quarterback looks at this and goes, okay, this is either cover 3 or this is single high. That's what this is. Typically you give them off man on the outside. So they're thinking, okay, this is either off man, single high, or this is a cover 3. This is something you'd see from the Seahawks. This is something you see from Richard Sherman. But here's the problem. That's not what this is at all. This is that single high safety is not going to cover deep middle. He's actually going to come up. He's the middle of the field safety. He's going to come toward the line of scrimmage, not back, which means the things you thought were going to be open, specifically the middle of the field, those 10 to 15-yard drag or crossing routes, those overs that you thought were going to be open based on what you saw, aren't going to be open anymore. And here's where it gets real tricky, because one of those safeties is, I mentioned, down in the box, and they're typically a hook zone defender or they're a flat zone defender. They can switch spots, Greg. They can switch spots and mess you up so badly. So now you say, okay, at the snap, before the snap, you think, okay, this is single high or this is cover 3. And then after the snap, you see the safety come up and go, wait, is this, but hold on, is he the middle of the field safety? But meanwhile, your hook safety, who was down in the box, tripped back and he becomes your middle of the field safety. And your single high guy now sprints out to the side and covers the hook zone. So you've got players in spots they're not supposed to be because you think, this is my beater. I have stuff installed to beat this coverage. And then when you go to that stuff, it doesn't work. And that's where the joy comes in. The joy comes in that you can run anything you want, Greg, because you just said, brings all back around to what you said. We don't know which one's the free safety and which one's the strong safety. This is how that applies, because you can run anything you want from any formation you want and still get to your landmarks on time.
Well, it's always going to be such a trademark of this defense while those two are here, and why in Joe's recent show about who would be the most devastating injury, I made the case for Micah Hyde, in that just what he allows us to do from a versatility standpoint. And you can see how the other cascading pieces fit in when you have the versatility those two have, with a guy who can shut off his corner of the side of the field like Tre'Davious White can. When you have a middle linebacker with the crazy range that, no one's built like Tremaine Edmonds, the speed, the wingspan, the height, what he's able to cut off in whatever zone he's doing, and even some of the sideline to sideline ability of a Matt Milano. That's really where the exciting part comes. And if we see someone like Ed Oliver take that step forward to where he's consistently able to beat his man and get pressure up the middle, all of a sudden, you described it really well, in that this isn't having a perfectly disguised coverage doesn't necessarily show itself the way Jim Johnson perfectly timed blitz does, because his perfectly timed blitzes were just a free shot of the quarterback, and it was very obvious for every fan to see. Sometimes the perfectly set up disguised coverage instead of a disguised blitz, it simply buys you that extra 1.5 seconds at the beginning of the play where the quarterback has to recalibrate what he thought was going to happen and now start over again with a new read. And then it takes him a second to do that. Now you're at the 2.5 seconds. All of a sudden, now if your guy beat their guy, you get what really was a coverage sack, but as fast as what a guy normally just beat his guy really well. You're able to kind of reset that timing. And even though it looked like somebody getting blown up, from a defensive line standpoint, it really was just like a micro coverage sack, because you were forcing the quarterback to recalibrate and look somewhere else. And that's where the excitement could come, that if they built this defensive line with the waves of talent that they've put together, and now you're able to play some of these games, and that I thought Matthew Fairburn spoken to it really well, that continuity can be kind of a crutch and an excuse to be inactive in when change is needed. But I think inarguably this season, continuity is a value, and that you're going to come into the season, especially the 4 games. I know that schedule metric was making its way around when you look at the projected win totals out of Vegas for the first 4 games of each team. The Bills have the 3rd easiest opening 4-game slate of anybody. So the combination of a nice cushiony start with the most continuity in the league of returning players, those games they can play in the secondary, those disguised coverages could really be fun early on here. And I'm really excited to see where they go. Before we let the fans know what is coming up on the Bruce exclusive and things like that, any closing thoughts on this secondary and what you think we may see out of the collection of talent they've put together this year?
I think that this year has a chance to be the best defense that McDermott has had.
I agree.
It's a very reasonable chance based on the talent, based on the continuity, based on the fact that you're going to be able to take advantage early on of some teams who don't have that continuity. Early on in this year, the Bills are going to face some teams that have a bunch of new pieces, new coordinators, things like that. Whereas Micah, Hyde, and Jordan Poyer is just chugging along. At this point, they do this stuff in their sleep. And there's an opportunity for the Bills defense. And, I talked about on the Bruce exclusive how I'm getting kind of annoyed with people who are in the national media or national fans who don't follow are talking about how the Bills are going to be the 2018 Bears or the 2017 Jags. And I talked about
regression is an automatic.
Right. Regression is automatic. Well, regression might be depending on the reason why you were highly ranked to begin with. And we talked ad nauseum about the reason why the Bills are consistently good in defense isn't because they're getting fluky defensive touchdown numbers or crazy high pressure rates. It's because they play good, sound defense with interchangeable parts that makes things unnecessarily difficult for the quarterback. And that's
I'd make the case that they've actually been below average and in position for positive regression from the flukiness of big plays. That there have been very few pick sixes, very few strip sack fumbles, very few of those games that we know are fluky. Like last year's Patriots team, they didn't have the best defense in NFL history. They had a really good defense who had a very fortunate fluky start to the year with some really big plays. I actually would argue that the Bills haven't had that and have been below average there, and that anything of, a minor step back in some other area could be offset by, or even more than offset by, just some slightly above average fortune from a big play standpoint.
We talk about regression to the mean all the time. What about progression to the mean?
Yeah.
That's a real thing too. And so this idea that the Bills had basically no defensive touchdowns over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And the Bears had like 5 interceptions for touchdowns during their crazy year. It was obscene. Jacksonville had an unbelievable pressure rate that was completely unsustainable. If anything, the Bills might have better chances this year at having a reasonable defense. And there's a reason for optimism. It's not like there's no reason for optimism. Not like we're being unnecessarily optimistic. There's reason behind it. And one of those reasons is this secondary.
I agree completely. And I think that there's a really good path to something exciting here with, I think that some people see that as kind of a high ceiling, low floor scenario. And I actually think it's the best of both worlds. I think they have a really high ceiling and an incredibly high floor. I think that the chances that this defense regresses to simply league average, I honestly think are really low. I think that our worst case scenario is a pretty good defense. I think our worst case scenario is the 10th or 12th defense in the league. I don't see some stumble and fallback like you reference with, the 18 Jags and the 19 Bears stepping back from their big seasons. I think it's more likely we see that kind of step back from the Patriots in being the number 1 defense in the league last year. I think that with them losing Collins and Van Noy and Danny Shelton and Durant Harmon and the pieces they lost, there's a better chance they take the more material step back. So I'm curious to see where that goes. And I really enjoyed the conversation tonight. And I hope the fans were awesome here being able to chime in the chat. It's been a lot of fun being able to go through here, and you guys can see why I asked Bruce to come on tonight. Not only is he very talented from a host standpoint and being able to go through there, I knew he'd be the guest to dive into the detail from a secondary standpoint. Speaking of which, if you haven't been listening to the Bruce exclusive or reading some of his articles over in Buffalo Rumblings, shame on you. You should change that immediately. But Bruce, why don't you let the fans know maybe something coming up that you've been working on, or what your next series is coming off of your football myths series that you put together?
So we're going to be working this week on a cross-examination of my wins are not a quarterback stat. I had initially planned to dive right in to Know Thy Enemy, which is going to be a series on our fellow AFC East foes. And then I got a message over the weekend from somebody who I have great respect for, who said, hey, I'd like to cross-examine you a little bit on this whole wins are not a quarterback stat thing. So we're going to try and get that together. And then I'm going to do a quick little aside based on the suggestion of one of the listeners. And the quick little aside that we're going to do is why Josh Allen is not Mitch Trubisky and why Josh Allen is not Blake Bortles. So we're going to have a little discussion about that. I have never been confused. You know this well. I've never been confused for a Josh Allen apologist. I'm not here to tell you that he's a superstar. I'm here to tell you that comparing him to Mitchell Trubisky is lazy. And saying that he's going to have a step back because Mitchell Trubisky did is lazy. Now, if you want to have a different discussion, I'm willing to. But I've basically had enough of, you can tell, I've basically had enough of the Bears Jaguars comparisons. Yeah. And so,
like I said, it's lazy.
Yeah, it's lazy
on both fronts.
So we're going to have a discussion about why Josh Allen is not Mitchell Trubisky. We're going to have a discussion about why Josh Allen's not Blake Bortles. We're going to allow for some cross-examination on my why wins are not a quarterback stat. And then we're going to go into Know Thy Enemy. We're going to do into an AFC East preview series where we're going to talk a little bit about the Jets and a little bit about the Patriots. I'm sure the Cam Newton thing is going to be up front and center for that. And we're going to talk about Sam Darnold versus Josh Allen. And we're going to talk about Tua Tagovailoa. And we're talking about Ryan Fitzpatrick and Chan Gailey's offense and all that stuff. It's going to be a good time.
Awesome. Hey, I'm certainly a big fan. I don't ever miss it. I've had the opportunity. I appreciate it to be able to join you there and love having you back over here for our home and home series. It's been a lot of fun to be able to do this and to see your well-deserved rise in the world of Bills Mafia. I think it's exciting to see people who are passionate about the game and understand the things that you do to come and share those. And I certainly appreciate someone who I think takes a similar path that I do in wanting to take some of the more complex different parts of the football world and try to help make them digestible and enjoyable for all fans to be able to experience. So, Bruce, thank you for joining us tonight. For everybody else listening, it's again, we're going to continue on with this series. We've made a lot of progress so far. We've got a couple pieces left. We've got some tight ends. We've got some linebackers. We've got some wide receivers left to go. So we're going to have a little bit of fun with some of those here to wrap up as we get all the way into what was going to be preseason. And then we'll start getting into, how this roster shapes up. We'll probably take a show to talk about what the newest rules are, as this is changing by the hour of who's going to report to what from a training camp standpoint. We'll kind of go through whatever the latest and greatest is next week of where those players are being set to report. But appreciate everybody diving through this series. Hopefully it's been valuable for you guys to be able to get a refresher, or for those who had been hearing positive things about your own Buffalo Bills and wanting to jump back on that bandwagon. Hopefully this has been a good series for you to get warmed back up to who are the names on the roster, who you should be excited about, and why there's a reason to be optimistic about this Buffalo Bills season. Again, for our friend from Buffalo Rumblings, from the Bruce Exclusive, please follow him on Twitter at Bruce Exclusive. Come find me at Greg Tompsett. Follow us at Cover One. Join us at cover1.net. You have been listening to the Cover One Buffalo podcast, and we are out. All right. Appreciate it, brother.
No problem.